I actually think school choice is doing fine out there in the country. I think the only place it's really not doing fine is in rooms like this, in DC, among a few hundred people who are policy elites, among a handful of large donors who help shape the organizations and priorities of these Edreform movement, such as it is. And actually, I am hopeful because I think that mostly what those 300 people think and mostly what those foundations do doesn't matter. Mostly, programs are out there providing people with choices that they like and benefit from, and so then they organize and politically fight to keep them, and they also organize and fight to expand them if they have the political resources to do so. And in fact, new programs are being adopted on a regular basis, both in the area of private school choice, and charter school choice is also expanding at a fairly steady clip. There are spurts of growth and periods of slower growth, but it is growth on a pretty steady basis. So really, I'm not here to make a case that we need to do something or Edreform will die. I'm trying to say, actually, to a group of people who can influence policy elites, that I think we can be a wind at reformers' backs rather than a wind in their face, right? We could help them rather than hinder them, but they're going to move forward either way. It doesn't really matter too much, I think. So I think the way that policy elites, and this is a gross overgeneralization, but again, there's a group of roughly 300 people who are actively involved in these issues and 5 major foundations that are actively involved in these issues. And I think they've taken a turn that is an undesirable turn based on a wrong premise. So the premise they have is that we policy elites, we foundation officials, we know which are the good schools and which are the bad schools. We know. And if we know, then really what we want to do is we want to expand good schools and close bad schools. And sure, school choice is fine, but people should only be able to choose among good schools. No one should choose a bad school. And we're going to establish regulatory systems. We're going to selectively provide subsidies to certain school operators to ensure that only the good schools are available for people to choose and the bad ones are not, okay? And I think this entire enterprise is built on a belief that the way we know which are the good schools and the bad schools is by looking at test scores. And while I like looking at test scores also, I think that they're a lot less good at indicating whether a school is good or bad than the 300 people who are the policy elites think, okay? So, what evidence do we actually have that if we change test scores, we will change lives? After all, we don't actually care about changing test scores. Test scores are a proxy, we believe, for some later outcome in life that matters. And so we've built an entire enterprise around changing test scores, and we validate whether the things we're doing are good or bad based on whether we change test scores, and with the belief that later on this will lead to good things for kids. And so how much evidence do we really have that this occurs? Now, I'm not saying there's no evidence. There are studies out there, rigorously identified studies that show a connection between changing test scores and changing later life outcomes. But if our assumption is correct, that test scores, changing test scores is a reliable indicator of quality, it should be a regular finding. It should be that most of the time we find that programs, interventions that change test scores change lives, okay? And if we don't find it regularly, we should worry about whether we really know how to identify which are the good schools, which are the bad schools, which are the good interventions, which are the bad interventions. So Can anyone tell me, shout out, other than Chetty Rockoff Friedman, can anyone tell me a rigorously identified intervention that changes test scores and that has been shown to change later life outcomes as well?
SAS in Florida.
Okay, SAS in Florida, the Florida charter schools didn't change test scores. Okay, so rigorously identified change in test scores from a program and rigorously identified change in later life outcome. Marcus.
Harvard Children's Own Schools.
What?
Prior to the paper on Harvard Children's Own Schools showing test score improvements and a bunch of other outcomes.
Actually, don't think that's right.
Texas one finds nothing, but then he finds.
I think Harlan Promise Academy actually doesn't find that. In fact, let's take a look at we have a series of studies that are, this is just in the area of school choice. So there are other kinds of interventions that might change test scores that also might change later life outcomes. And in those other areas, we also, by the way, frequently find disconnects between the test score changes we observe and the later life outcomes that we observe. So for example, preschool. A lot of the preschool literature has not really found much in the way of changing test scores, but has found very large later life outcomes. And if you believe that literature, that would be another example of a disconnect. But just if we just focus within the area of school choice, I can think of 10, I'm aware of 10 studies that have rigorous identification both of test score outcomes and later life outcomes. Okay? There may be more that I'm not aware of, but I know of 10. Okay? So I'm going to show you all 10 that I know of. So for example, the Boston Charter study that Susan was co-author on here, so she probably will tell me I'm misreading it, but it shows huge test score gains, and not just on the state test, but it also shows it on other things like AP. Okay, so these are not purely gaming of a state test that we're talking about. There are, I think, real improvements in cognitive performance, okay? But the later life outcomes so far don't match those huge test score gains. So there's no increase in high school graduation in the Boston Charter study. There, in fact, is a decrease in high school graduation rate after 4 years, but it's made up in the 5th year. So the charter students are taking an extra year, which, by the way, comes at a cost. That is a harm, potentially. But it evens out after 5 years. But there's no effect of Boston Charters on post-secondary enrollment that they report, that I've seen. Right, and there is a shift from 2 to 4 year. I don't think we can make that hop, skip, and a jump from other studies, actually, because I'm not sure it applies to these students, because perhaps what's happening is these schools are very good at counseling kids into 4-year schools, and it's an open question as to whether that is a correct placement for them. Should they be in a 4-year school, or should they be in a 2-year school? And while the Boston Charter study does find this big shift from 2 to 4 years in their post-secondary enrollment, although no aggregate increase in post-secondary enrollment, we don't know whether we're setting kids up for failure in 4-year institutions. Perhaps they're going to 4-year schools, they're not really prepared or want to be in 4-year schools in some deeper sense. They drop out with missed opportunities and debt. And so it's unclear whether this is good, bad, or indifferent for them. And let's put it this way, even if there is something good here in the later life outcomes, even if we can see something good in it, it doesn't line up with the huge test score gains. Like, if these things are going in the same direction, they should look like they're, like, not just direction, but magnitude should be something comparable, and it doesn't look like that. But it's not, you don't have to rely on one. We can look at the Harlan Promise Academy, which I think is the one you were referring to, Marcus, and it's actually the same result. There's no increase in high school graduation rate. There's no increase in post-secondary enrollment. There is a shift from 2 to 4 years. Same thing. That's what they find. KIP. Everyone says KIP increases post-secondary enrollment. I have yet to find this rigorously identified finding. The only rigorously identified finding I can find is the Mathematica study, which shows, again, large test score gains, but either no or small effect on high school graduation rate, depending on whether they use the RCT or or a matched sample. Okay, I think that's the difference between the two, but it's not. It doesn't line up with the test score gains. High Tech High. There was a dissertation out of Harvard. It's widely praised for improving test scores. He didn't actually rigorously identify those test score gains, so this is cheating a bit. But reputationally, everyone believes High Tech High is a great improver of test scores, but there's no increase in college enrollment from that program in an RCT. Seed boarding schools, same as Boston charters. Texas No Excuses. This is the newer Dobie Fryer result. Increased test scores in college enrollment, but no effect on earnings. Okay? So that's in one direction, but there are also disconnects in the other direction. So we have, as Matt indicated, the Florida charter study, and while they in that study did not identify Florida test score gains, other research has suggested that there are no substantial test score gains being achieved by these Florida charter schools, but they find huge increases in high school graduation rate, college attendance, and earnings from students who attend Florida charters. Similarly, my colleague Pat Wolf's study of DC vouchers, there is a test score gain. It may fade out by the fourth year. It's unclear whether that's a true fade out or just an attrition of the sample that leads to an increase in standard errors, but in any event, there's a very large increase in high school graduation rate that doesn't seem to line up to otherwise underwhelming test score gains. Milwaukee vouchers, same deal. We have little or no test score gain, but large increase in high school graduation rate. And New York vouchers, we similarly have modest test score gains, but very large later increases in college enrollment. And so, if we're making errors in both directions, if there are interventions out there that are rigorously identified that find that you can increase test scores but not change lives, and you can also fail to increase test scores and change lives, then the test scores are not going to be an incredibly reliable indicator of quality. And yet, we're building our whole enterprise around this. Our entire enterprise of identifying which are the good schools, which are the bad schools, calling out the bad, only giving subsidies and the right to exist to the good that we experts identify using our scientific tool, because we put on our lab coat to identify. But as it turns out, we're not that good at identifying them. We don't know with confidence. I mean, I'm not saying that the Boston charter schools are not doing something really good. They probably are. It's just that we're not that confident about it, given that we don't see the later life outcomes that we would expect to see. Okay? So all of this, these 10 studies I've shown you, which I think is the entire universe of choice studies with later life outcomes, but you can bring up others if you know of them, and none of them have a very good disconnect, and the disconnect goes in both directions. This is all from rigorously identified uses of test scores. Actual policymakers, they don't use rigorously identified test scores, right? Actual foundations, portfolio managers, they're not using RCTs to identify effects on test scores. What they're doing usually is looking at the level of test scores, which is awful, okay? I mean, no one believes that has anything to do, really, with school quality, looking at the level. But most systems that are identifying good and bad schools and culling the bad and rewarding the good are relying almost entirely on the level of test scores. So portfolio management in New Orleans, how does the portfolio manager in New Orleans identify which are the good schools and which are the bad schools? What test scores are they looking at? The New Orleans test system does have a value-added component, but it constitutes 5% of the total school grade. Okay? So the vast majority of what they're using to identify good and bad schools are the level of test scores. Even when they're using change in test scores, which, by the way, is a rare creature out there, among the people who are actually opening schools, allowing schools to open and be subsidized and closing other schools, or creating regulations that they validate with test scores, even if they use change in test scores, they're using crude, non-rigorously identified changes in test scores. I mean, they're mostly using delta, or maybe some slightly more sophisticated VAM analysis, which does not actually rigorously identify how much that school contributes to learning growth. It doesn't. I mean, it does it better than a poke in the eye, but it's not as good as RCT. So, does anyone see any, other than the general disconnect here, does anyone see any other patterns? I do. One is that the 300 folks who populate DC and Foundation and so on, those 300 folks, they have glommed onto what they believe is the correct model. Okay? In fact, after the Boston Charter study came out, I had people at a very prominent foundation come up to me and say, Eureka, we figured it out. We know what the right model of schooling is. It's no excuses, as they're doing in Boston. How do we get every school to look like no excuses? That's our challenge as a foundation, okay? And yet, if you look at it, it's the no excuses ones that seem to produce big test score gains, but not much later. And it's the mom and pop or private school choice programs that produce underwhelming test results but large later life outcomes. That's the pattern I see. Now, that's not a finding. That's just eyeballing 10 studies. That's not a rigorous finding. But it's a pattern that is at odds with the groupthink consensus among the 300. I don't know if it's a Sparta. They believe that they put on their lab coats, they use science, they found out the answer. The answer is no excuses charters. We need to design programs and regulations that drive everyone into the correct model and prevent them from choosing. So you can have school choice out there as long as it's all McDonald's, but good McDonald's, because science has told us McDonald's is nutritious. I mean, that's basically, I think, where we are as a movement. Now, I don't think that this has very serious long-term repercussions. This mistaken thinking has very serious long-term repercussions for school choice, because policymakers out there in the states where actual policy occurs mostly don't care about any of this and mostly aren't listening anyway, okay? And mostly they're being driven by constituents who are benefiting from school choice, like it, and are advocating to keep it and get more of it. That's mostly what they're responding to. So thankfully, our wrong ideas probably won't do too much damage, but to the extent that we push state policymakers to regulate, and in as much as we selectively provide subsidies to a single model, which may not be the correct model, then we're a headwind rather than a tailwind. And I think I would like us to be the opposite, and I'd like to at least spark a conversation about whether we really have confidence that we know good from bad. And by the way, if we can confidently identify good from bad, why have school choice at all? Right? Let's just identify good. I mean, the whole enterprise, frankly, feels a little bit like a Soviet 5-year plan, right? Let's figure out, what should be produced, and let's measure it scientifically, right? The Soviets thought they were scientific, and we'll have metrics of tonnage of tractors, and people will produce giant tractors, and this doesn't end well if they actually have control. Luckily, our 5-year plan at a foundation actually doesn't control what happens, thankfully. So that is my provocation to you to start today.